Alright, ladies and gentlemen, so finally Hakim made a video response to me. Now, he didn't mention my name, but I could tell it was responding to me because of a few of the details he mentioned. The obvious reasons for him not mentioning my name are number one, so people wouldn't send me this video to thoroughly debunk it, and number two, because I challenged him to a debate, and he does not want to address the fact that he saw the debate challenge. Because there is no way that Hakim could ever defend these ideas. In a live debate, you can't get your friends to spend 5 weeks writing a 25-page rebuttal. And a weak rebuttal at that. Anyways, so we're just going to jump straight into his video and tear it to shreds.
Hello. You've probably seen this study around, Economic Development, Political Economic System, and the Physical Quality of Life by Saraceto and Waitskin. I won't go through this study again today as I've already done so twice, but the gist of it is this. The study empirically shows that under equal levels of development, socialist countries consistently scored higher on quality of life based on actual life indicators, access to healthcare, education, employment, minority rights, nutritional intake, etc. In response to this, it seems there have been a handful of quote-unquote responses. I hesitate to even call them that, as they're more like incoherent diatribes against concepts they fail to understand, but oh well. Seeing as this is the case, I thought I'd put their criticism in context, show how it's fallacious, and also discuss some more studies on the superiority of socialism if we have the time. I didn't even know people were talking about this till someone sent me a thread by a Reddit user named Hyasa Bruzzy, so thanks, Habibi. With that said though, let's get started. Now, their arguments can be broken down into several. They either criticize the age of the paper, claim the data used is somehow not correctly interpreted, that this or that apparently socialist country is listed as a capitalist one, ooh, and a general lack of understanding of definitions amongst other things. Let's deal with them one by one. Argument number 1. The socialists skewed the data. Citation needed.
Okay, the turning point, revitalizing the Soviet economy. Soviet economists admitted to skewing data on purpose. There you go, there's your source.
Really. The study uses the World Bank's own data.
So earlier Hakim claimed in an incredibly condescending way that the people who responded to him, including myself, didn't know about any of these things we're talking about. Yet him right here didn't even know what his own study was. No, this is not World Bank data, it is data compiled by the World Bank. The data does in fact come from the governments of these countries.
By the way, corrupt bureaucrats fiddling data to look better is an argument that goes both ways. In fact, unlike the nebulous claim it is for socialist countries, we know for a fact that capitalists regularly fiddle data, from finance to emission reports on newly produced vehicles, so unless you're willing to fall on the blade of that double-edged logic, the data is fine.
So he shows this article about Rwanda fiddling with its economic data, and the funny thing about this is that the World Bank rejected this notion. So do we fully trust the World Bank or not? This guy didn't do any reading or research for this video.
Argument number 3. Ex-socialist countries listed as capitalist. Yeah, no. Just because some party calls itself socialist doesn't make it socialist. There are real definitions that reflect realities on the ground, and no,
when the government does stuff,
isn't socialism for the love of God. If that were true, then that would mean literally every country on earth is socialist, and that capitalism has never been tried. I swear being a libertarian just makes your brain rot or something.
That was sure an ownage there. Anyways, this guy proceeds to never actually define what socialism is. In a little bit, he says that it's essentially planned economies versus market economies. But again, he doesn't define what socialism is. How are we supposed to say which ones are socialist and which ones are capitalist if we can't even agree on a definition? Clearly, the people on the pro-capitalist side have different definitions than he does. He simply rejects these definitions, doesn't give a reason why though. How socialist does a country have to be socialist? The countries he's citing had state-owned enterprise. Clearly he thinks state-owned enterprise, the government doing stuff, is socialism. But how much stuff does the government have to do? Is the government owning NASA partly socialist? Is it not? Were the Soviet space programs socialist? Why not? What was the difference? He doesn't attempt to answer any of this stuff. This is why I prefer to use an actual measurement, such as private property rights. If you have an actual measurement instead of arbitrary definitions, you can say, oh look, this country is really capitalist and it's doing great. This country is just slightly capitalist and it's doing okay. This country is slightly socialist and it's doing okay. This country is completely socialist and it's doing horrible. If you have some sort of measurement like this, you can get much more accurate data and arguments as to why it's either socialism or capitalism benefiting these countries. With these arbitrary measurements of these faintly capitalist countries being completely capitalist under his definition, how are we supposed to draw any actual conclusions? Oh yeah, 49% of the economy being owned by the state is just capitalist. And 51% is socialist. This is just stupid, and it's so obvious why we shouldn't do this. And the reason he doesn't want to do this, and the reason socialists don't want to do this, is because the results are overwhelmingly positive for the capitalist side. He wants to include these underdeveloped, mildly capitalistic countries in order to skew the data.
The classification within the study was based on whether a nation had a centrally planned economy or a market economy. In fact, this is the same classification you see in many CIA documents even. If the CIA can easily point out which countries are socialist and you can't, then you're either blind, stupid, or both. Let's list a few just for fun, though. Remember, this is all for the early 80s period. Syria, not a socialist country, never had a centrally planned economy, and in fact the Syrian Ba'ath Party was beginning to liberalize the economy during the era.
At the time in Syria, the government dominated the economy, owning over 3/5 of it. In the 70s, there was mild liberalization in order to promote economic growth, and it worked. There was further liberalization in the late 1980s, after the study was conducted, after the significant failures of government policy and nationalization. These came as a result of going towards socialism back in the 1960s. The book Syria, A Country Study, documents this very well.
Tanzania nationalized a handful of businesses, but no central planning.
Wait, how is an economy that's entirely made up of nationalized businesses called central planning, but an economy with some nationalized businesses has no central planning? Once again, this guy makes no sense and contradicts himself. Yes, Tanzania was centrally planned. The Encyclopedia Britannica even describes it as a centrally planned economy. They began market liberalization in 1986, after the study was conducted.
Mali, no economic planning whatsoever, and a rapidly liberalized economy after transition of power within the same party.
It was very hard to find information on the economic history of Mali, so I did kind of give up. However, what I did find was a handful of papers talking about Mali wanting to go towards a Soviet-style planned economy back in the 60s. Now, what I found was written before this really came into fruition, so I'm not 100% sure how far this went. However, given Hakim's track record on being extremely dishonest, I would not be surprised if it was entirely centrally planned at this time. However, I will not make that claim.
Iraq, just like Syria, a bunch of nationalized industry does not a socialist country make.
This is another reason why we should have some sort of actual metric. Iraq was going through nationalization, they had strong Marxist influences in their politics, and were even allies with the Soviet Union at this time. But since they weren't quite nationalized enough, all of their failures are projected onto capitalism, even though no one like Hakim could actually contribute any of their economic failures to capitalism in any way, because they're not capitalism's fault.
Congo, Guinea, Senegal, I could go on. But what about Burma? What about the Burmese road to socialism? Yeah, again, a ruling socialist party doesn't make it socialist. You need to look at the concrete policies taken.
So he mentioned the Burmese road to socialism because I'm the one who brought it up. And then he goes into the straw man. I never claimed that it was socialist because of a ruling socialist party. I said that they had started on the path to socialism already and they were nationalizing things, and this was causing great economic decline. This is objectively true. And I actually lived in Burma for a period, so it actually really annoys me when people like Hakim try to talk about it and just lie about it. The Enterprise Nationalization Law was passed in 1963. All major industries in Burma had been nationalized. Newspapers had been nationalized. How was this not central planning? Hakim knew all of this stuff. In fact, you can just Google the Burmese way to socialism and find so many articles, even a Wikipedia page about it. All of them go over the nationalization, the changes in the economy, but he ignored this, either because he intentionally did not do the research, or because he did and he saw that it wasn't a good look for him. This is why he had to lie about my position and claim it was just a socialist party in charge, when that was never my argument in the first place.
Both Labour in the UK and the Swedish Social Democratic Party were socialist parties that had official statements of attempting to establish socialism in their respective countries. Unless you're willing to lump them under successes of socialism, as social democratic countries have usually better indicators on living standards than neoliberal ones, you can't consider Burma to all of a sudden be socialist. An argument can be made for Libya being socialist, but that's a conversation for another time. Regardless, the indicators for Libya actually skew the data more favorably for the capitalist side, so I don't think these people have seriously read the very short study. Again, you can only find an issue with this breakdown of market versus central planning if you yourself consider any minimal form of nationalization or government intervention to be socialism. And if that's the case, well, Allah yarhamak, as we say in Arabic.
Let me explain this in a very simple way. Let's say a capitalist house is a house built out of bricks, and a socialist house is a house built out of sticks. And let's say in this area where all the little piggies are living, there's no houses that are 100% bricks, and there are no houses that are 100% sticks. Some houses come very close to being 100% sticks, and you're saying, yeah, this is socialism. Because look at all the sticks, there's so many sticks, there's only like one brick in this house. But then when we point to another house that is, say, 60% sticks, you say, oh no, that's not socialism, because look at all of those bricks, there's so many bricks. Even though bricks are the minority. If you want to actually judge the efficiency of building a house out of bricks or building it out of sticks, you look at the parts that are made out of bricks and the parts that are made out of sticks. You don't look at a house made out of 60% sticks and say, well, this had some failures, so that must be the fault of the bricks. Now, Hakim, did the little piggies make it easier to understand? I really hope so, because clearly you need something at the level of a children's book to actually understand what you're talking about.
Cerecetto and Waitzkin's research has been recreated as well. Another study, The Political and Economic Determinants of Health Outcomes, a cross-national analysis by Lena and London, studied the conclusions of the aforementioned study, redid the analyses, and...
Well, they didn't just redo the analyses, they did health analyses, like it, says in the title, and actually, funnily enough, under the right-wing norms, it performed better than left-wing norms. When it comes to these studies, it's all about how they word certain things and put together certain things. And once again, the countries included in this are a bit arbitrary on which ones are capitalist or which ones are socialist or left-wing or right-wing. That's why we should really agree on some solid measurements. It's also why we shouldn't have sociologists performing economic studies, because they don't know anything about economic data or economics. They just put in their own arbitrary opinions. And yes, these two studies he cited were performed by sociologists, not economists. If we look at actual economic data compiled by economists, it tells a much different story. And now we will proceed to go over the overwhelming amount of data that shows that Hakim is incorrect, of course. First up, Economic Freedom of the World, an Accounting of the Literature. This was compiled by two economists, Joshua C. Hall and Robert A. Lawson. It looks at several different indexes of economic freedom. Economic freedom being more capitalism, which is, of course, more private property rights, freedom of businesses, freedom of trade. These two economists looked at over 400 studies on the matter. Over 2/3 of the studies found that more capitalism corresponded with better outcomes such as faster growth, better living standards, more happiness, etc. While less than 4% of the studies showed capitalism to be associated with bad outcomes. These include things like increased income inequality. Now, I did cite these before, and Hakim briefly mentioned them in a way, but he said that they were funded by oil money and therefore they are wrong. This is number one, a bold claim that he didn't prove, and number two, simply incorrect. In fact, the literature review authors found no significant bias in any of these studies. This also contradicts the criteria that Hakim set with his own studies, that you have to look at the data and criticize that instead of criticizing the authors, criticizing the date, criticizing the bias. Great going, Hakim, you contradicted yourself again. But I'm not surprised, because Stalinists are extremely anti-intellectual in a very similar way that Nazis are. Next, let's look at economic freedom and the quality of life, an empirical analysis. This was done by two economists, one at Eastern Michigan University and one at Villanova University. They concluded, employing newly developed measures of economic freedom, we analyzed the impact of economic freedom on life expectancy and literacy rates. Our findings support the hypothesis that greater economic freedom enhances the quality of life across nations and increases the improvements in the quality of life over time. Next, Economic Freedom, Democracy, and the Quality of Life by Michael D. Stroop. His statistical results showed that an increase in economic freedoms would improve all 6 measures of human well-being, regardless of the strength of democracy. These 6 measurements were adult literacy, percentage of total population attaining at least a 5th grade education, percentage of the total population with access to improved water sources, percentage of 2-year-old children having received adequate vaccination, years of life expectancy at birth for the total population, and child mortality rate per 1,000 children 5 years old or younger. Now, here's another study that actually was a lot more mainstream compared to most of these types of research. From this New York Post article, "Science proves communism makes nations poorer and less healthy." Researchers testing historical connections between cultures found that whether a country had been under communism was the biggest factor for those with lower health, income, and educational levels. In the first undertaking of its kind, they analyzed the fortune of 44 countries across Europe and Asia and looked at geography, religion, systems of governments, and a more intangible quality called deep cultural ancestry. So you notice right off the bat, they accounted for a lot more things than, for example, the socialist quality of life study accounted for. And that goes for most of my citations. There's so many different variables that can be accounted for, really. Everything from geography to weather to IQ to how long the country was actually communist or socialist or capitalist. The length actually is a pretty big factor. And again, back to what I mentioned earlier, the actual extent of it being socialist, which all of my citations accounted for. But anyways, this study was published in the journal Royal Society Open Science. Now, I do not believe it was performed by economists. However, this was done very well, and this is very, very high statistical strength. Not to mention, it's not a very economic-orientated study in the first place, so the whole economist thing doesn't quite apply as much here. Now let's move on to a few other great papers. These ones are mostly additional information, or actually debunking some of the studies that Hakim cites later in his video but doesn't actually go over. Was Stalin necessary for Russia's economic development? This was a paper by 4 economists focusing on the Russian Industrial Revolution. Their conclusion was, therefore our answer to the "was Stalin necessary?" question is a definite no. Even though we do not consider the human tragedy of famine, repression, and terror and focus on economic outcomes alone, and even when we make assumptions that are biased in Stalin's favor. His economic policies underperformed the counterfactual. We believe Stalin's industrialization should not be used as a success story in development economics, and should instead be studied for an example where brutal reallocation resulted in lower productivity and lower social welfare. So yeah, this is actually a very excellent study that looked at other countries such as Japan and also looked at growth rates in Tsarist Russia. And the evidence just overwhelmingly shows that Stalin's Industrial Revolution was nothing special. Alec Nove came to similar conclusions in his book, Was Stalin Really Necessary? Alec Nove is the world's leading expert on Soviet economics, and Hakim has actually cited Alec Nove before. Next, I want to go over these 2 synthetic control analyses. One is a 2006 one looking at Venezuela. It's by Kevin Gregg and Norman Maynard, and they are 2 economists. It's entitled The Economic Consequences of Hugo Chavez, a Synthetic Control Analysis. We find that, although average income rose somewhat during his time as president, they lagged far behind where they might have been if Chavez had not taken office. During his leadership, life expectancy grew, while mortality and poverty rates fell. Yet we find no evidence that these gains are any different than they would have been with another national leader. If anything, life expectancy rose slower than what the control predicted. On the positive side of the ledger, it may have been the case that inequality fell faster than it would have without Chavez in office after 2003. But we see no evidence that his term in office as a whole reduced inequality more than it would have without him. While these results are not produced in a complete simultaneous model, they suggest that the observed reductions in inequality and poverty should not be attributed to Chavez's leadership, and that Chavez's legacy might have more to do with the harm caused to per capita incomes. There's also one more synthetic control analysis, titled The Cuban Experiment, measuring the role of the 1959 revolution on economic performance using synthetic control. I'm not going to go over it right now, but I highly recommend checking it out if you can. Since we can't go over that right now, let's look at this paper, Cuban Infant Mortality and Longevity, Healthcare or Repression. I actually had one of the authors of this paper on my YouTube channel before, so go back and check out my video on Cuba. One of the studies Hakim cites later in his video actually talks about this, the Cuban infant mortality rate and life expectancy. This paper right here points out the many flaws in using this as an argument. Cuba manipulates their data in many different ways, such as with forced abortions. You also see skews in data because of things like cars per capita. For example, in Brazil, where the car ownership rate is 7.3 times above that of Cuba, Road fatalities reduce male and female life expectancy at birth by 0.8 and 0.2 years. The paper goes over a lot more arguments than this. I highly suggest you check it out. And again, check out the video I made on it.
Another great study is Has Socialism Failed? An analysis of health indicators under socialism. The abstract itself really sums it up. This article analyzes the widely held assumption in academia and the mainstream press that capitalism has proven superior to socialism in responding to human needs. The author surveys the health conditions of the world's populations, continent by continent, and shows that, contrary to dominant ideology, socialism and socialist forces have been, for the most part, better able to improve health conditions than have capitalism and capitalist forces.
Once I noticed that this study didn't include any control variables, I disregarded it. I don't know why these sociologists, yes, this was another sociologist, write these economic papers and think control variables just shouldn't exist. This one also suffered the same issues as other ones. It was very arbitrary in what socialism and capitalism were. It explicitly called India capitalist, and one of the biggest comparisons it made was between India and China. The only problem is at this time, most people would consider India to be socialist. India's socialist period, also known as the socialist boom, was from the 50s to the 70s. And this study's data is right smack in the middle of that. India was not capitalist at this time, it was actually de jurist, which is sort of a third position economic system, essentially similar to a mixed economy except far more socialist than a mixed economy typically is. There was a lot of nationalization in the 50s. The railways were completely owned and controlled by the government. The government had majority control over the banks, oil and gas, telecommunications, power plants, and ports. So India was definitely far away from a beacon of free markets. And this also kind of shows why variables are so important. India and China have very different populations, very different eating habits, and very different histories as well. And China wasn't exactly doing too great either. You had things like the Great Leap Forward and the extreme failures of the collectivization of agriculture.
The study shows, well, the usual stuff. Broken down by continent, we start with Latin America. Cuba started with similar, if not worse, indicators than most Latin American countries, and under socialism and relentless embargo by the US, pretty much matched or outmatched all of them.
No, this is not true. If it was true and Hakim wasn't lying, then he would show you this data. However, he just shows you the after data. Since I don't lie, I will show you the before and after data. As you can see here, Cuba actually already had very good literacy rates compared to most Latin American countries. It was also very similar with health outcomes, but I already gave you the source on health outcomes, as well as the one on economic outcomes. So yes, we can conclude that Cuba already measured pretty well compared to other Latin American countries pre-Castro. And post-Castro, we have evidence that they fudged their numbers. Even though Hakim claims this is not an argument, it is.
And many indicators exceeded the US as well. Life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, lowest levels of malnutrition. So much for haha, communism, no food. Hell, even things like access to toilets.
Did this guy really just say toilets? Okay, well, the health stuff I already refuted again, but toilets, bro, come on. In Havana and many places in Cuba, you have to pay to use public toilets. Not only that, but this is what the toilets look like. It's actually incredibly rare to find a toilet seat in Cuba, and also incredibly rare to find toilet paper with the toilets. I don't think this is something to be flexing on. Anyways, back to the overall data. Much more data is compiled in the book The Socialist System by Kornai. It's quite an excellent book, and it actually distinguishes capitalist and socialist countries in very good ways, such as looking at shares of public sectors. These are things that the left-wing sociologists do not do. And something that's pointed out in this book is pollution. Socialist countries have historically been way worse with pollution. So even assuming all of these arguments that Hakim presents are true, this comes with a trade-off of environmental disaster. It's no secret that a key to a better environment is more capitalism and more economic growth. Empirically, better ratings on Environmental Performance Index strongly correlate with economic freedom and economic growth. Actually, looking at global data on air pollution, you can see that the biggest fall of pollution in human history was the fall of the Soviet Union. This is due to many things, such as the tragedy of the commons and the economic calculation problem. When socialist countries fail to economically calculate, that leads to much waste. As pointed out in the book Collapse of an Empire, which was written by a Soviet economist, page 75, Examples of how inefficient the Soviet economy was are well known. The Soviet Union mined 8 times as much iron ore as did the United States. That ore yielded only 3 times as much pig iron, and the pig iron only twice as much steel. Finally, from that steel, it was able to produce machines worth roughly the same as those produced in the United States. The use of raw materials and energy in the production of each final product was respectively 1.6 and 2.1 times greater than the United States. The average construction time for an industrial plant in the USSR was more than 10 years. In the United States, it was less than 2 years. In manufacturing per unit, the USSR in 1980 used 1.8 times more steel than the United States, 2.3 times more cement, 7.6 times more mineral fertilizer, and 1.5 times more timber. The USSR produced 6 times as much grain harvesters, but harvested less grain and became dependent on grain imports. There's a lot of data on air pollution from the Soviet Union that you can look at yourself. But I will end with this, one of the biggest examples of socialist failures in the environment: how the Soviet Union created Central Asia's worst environmental disaster. What was once one of Central Asia's most recognizable geographical features and a great regional geoeconomic asset may no longer appear on future maps. Satellite imagery made available by NASA shows that a vast majority of the Aral Sea, once the world's 4th largest inland sea, has dried up. Going by current trends, the Aral Sea, with the exception of a small portion in the north, may disappear altogether. The resources released from NASA's Terra satellite highlights the decay of what was once a distinct feature of Central Asia's geography. They catalog the lake's gradual and dramatic reduction in size since 2000. The drying up of the Aral Sea was described by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as one of the world's worst environmental disasters in 2010. The Aral Sea, which is actually classified as a lake, has been steadily shrinking since the 1960s following Soviet irrigation efforts. The lake, which lies between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, began suffering its current fate due to a Soviet-era economic plan that sought to irrigate the nearby desert in Uzbekistan to promote greater economic output. For a short time, Uzbekistan became the world's largest exporter of cotton. This economic boom would not have been possible without the Soviet effort to divert water from the river that fed the Aral Sea, the Amudari, and the Syr-Darya. As a result of that human intervention, beginning in the 1960s, the lake began to slowly recede. By 2007, the Aral Sea had shrunk to 10% of its original size. According to NASA, this precipitated a broader economic and environmental crisis.